Frank Horvat is a Toronto-based composer and pianist. WholeNote Magazine mentions Frank as one of the most inventive songwriters to come out of the contemporary music scene in Canada. As an award-winning composer, Frank explores a wide variety of themes in his music, from love to the environment, mental health, and social justice issues. He has been featured on over a dozen albums on labels including ATMA Classique, Really Records, and Center Discs. With composition premieres on 4 continents, his works have been showcased internationally in theater, feature films, and radio and TV networks, including the CBC, CBS, Discovery, HBO, Vice, and Bravo. He has performed in a wide variety of venues and festivals worldwide, including the Glenn Gould Studio, Massey Hall, Beaches Jazz Festival, North by Northeast, Gallery 345, and New York City's St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. Frank is an associate composer at the Canadian Music Centre, a member of the Canadian League of Composers, and the inaugural recipient of the Kathleen McMorrow Music Award for Contemporary Composition. Here now is my recent conversation with Frank Horvat. I'm your host, Adrian Verdejo, from Redshift Radio, broadcasting from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, on the land of Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Before we get into your specific work, Frank, as well as some of the more recent highlights from your output, I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your background as a pianist and in your musical journey. What led you into composition, and at what point did you discover composition?
Yeah, absolutely. I was born and raised in Ottawa, and I started music. I started my journey in music quite early on, around the age of 5, actually, where my parents signed me up for, of all things, accordion lessons. I was sort of eager to and excited to take music lessons because the daughter of a family friend of my parents was taking organ lessons. And I thought, when I watched her play organ in her house, I thought that was the most magnificent, awesome thing, a little 4 or 5-year-old looking at this. And I said, "Mommy, I want to do that." And, my parents looked into it, but big problem, I was too short to reach the pedals. I was way too small. So I am a child of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and the accordion is a very important instrument in the cultural fabric of where my parents come from. And so the music school they signed me up to suggested, "Well, why don't you start with accordion?" And I actually never looked back. I really excelled at it and loved it, and I kept playing for quite a while, very seriously, going to competitions and so forth. But it was maybe around 10 or 11 years old that they started to incorporate piano lessons into my routine. And because I had experience from playing the accordion, it made that sort of easy. And I started loving the piano. I started really enjoying the piano. And unfortunately, the accordion, I look back now, I feel a little sad that I sort of let my skills dissipate with the accordion. I can still pick it up. I still have my accordion, and I can still pick it up the odd time and play, but nothing to the level of when I was really practicing a lot. And but that's how it sort of took off at 10, 11, and studying theory. And around that time, I also became interested in composition. I remember it's really common for me just to sit at the dining room table with blank manuscript paper and just start copying the music that I was playing, either on the accordion or the piano, and starting to compose little tunes. And the first piece I ever composed, or my first official composition, we entered into the Kiwanis Music Festival in Ottawa when I think I might have been 9 or 10, and I really enjoyed that process of creating, and it's just been always a very instinctive and honestly very spiritual part of my life, getting to this point.
While you were studying accordion, did you delve into classical repertoire, or was it later on the piano that you discovered some of the great masters that made the biggest impression on you, or were you kind of more playing folk music or playing by ear?
I wasn't playing by ear, well, although I could play by ear, but I was definitely having a formal instruction with method books and so forth, which explored a variety of repertoire, mostly folk tunes, some classical things, but not to the extent of perhaps we might see the classical accordion tradition, especially using the free bass accordion. I learned with the Stradella bass pattern of accordion, which is more synonymous with the folk tradition. So yes, without a doubt, it's definitely, I sort of became more musically astute once I started playing a lot of the repertoire on the piano, and sort of that nurtured my love for the tradition and the style and just the technical challenge of being able to play that. As a teenager, I was really into that. But at the same time, also exploring other things. When I was in high school, I really discovered jazz and playing in jazz bands and jamming with friends. And that was another important part of my creative thing. I grew up obviously from a very young age, whether it was accordion or a little bit later with piano, having the one-on-one formal weekly piano lesson. And that sort of thing can only go so far, and, exploring music to its fullest, the ability to play with others was so awesome. So I really see that as a monumental point in my musical upbringing, was to have joy of playing music with others.
Were your earliest compositions also for piano, or written for the ensemble of musicians that you're playing with at that time? And as sort of a B-side to that question, what was your introduction to formal composition instruction? Did you have a mentor? Was there a teacher that you decided to study with when you pursued post-secondary, or how did you enter into composition formally as a student?
Yeah, sure. A lot of my early compositions were very chamber-based. I remember, I think my very first one was for quite a unique combination of instruments. I think there was trombone, or recorder, accordion, these kind of things. I think my sort of more serious composition was for bassoon and piano, because I had a high school friend who was passionate about playing bassoon, so that was a piece for us to play together. And I remember in my last year of high school, I started writing for our class, featuring, like a wind ensemble type of setup. And so I really enjoyed that. I went to a really great high school in Ottawa with great music teachers that really nurtured all of this. But other than that, I did not have formal composition lessons growing up. I had the gamut of taking Royal Conservatory exams, both for piano and theory. And in fact, when I graduated from high school, the day I went to my prom, that's when I did my final ARCT teacher's piano exam. And I had completed all my theory classes. So I was really bombarded with a lot of that, everything basically but formal composition lessons. But that being said, I sort of then envisioned my university years as that. So then I applied to go to U of T, and I was accepted. I was very, very lucky. I developed my own independent portfolio on my own without any sort of formal guidance in the creation of those early compositions. And thankfully, I was accepted into there. And then that was another important moment in my musical upbringing, where now we can get into the nuts and bolts of the structure of being a composer, and I learned so much from that experience, and it was a very productive time to be a composition student. Going to the University of Toronto, the benefit there is they have such a large faculty, so there was so many friends I met in my 4 years there that allowed me to try the pieces out. So it wasn't just getting the guidance of amazing teachers and great composers themselves, but also, to have my friends say, hey, can you try playing this? And often some of them performed it in school performances. And it was such a great incubator of learning and giving me the tools needed to where I am today. I don't really think I had a voice yet, and at that point, it took years after into my professional life as a musician, as a composer, to start to develop, the voice that I felt comfortable with. But as a time to experiment and try and learn, wow, it was amazing.
Yeah, I often think about that in my own studies as well, Frank, as, the contacts and the friends that I was lucky enough to have studied with at that time, so many of which, we've remained in touch, and many of which have also become really close and trusted collaborators. So I think that's kind of one of those bonuses of attending a school, being around so many other brilliant people and so many talented people that you can't help but rub off, I think, and provide more inspiration. That's when I also think, as a performer, really became interested in working with composers, young composers who were, again, experimenting and trying to find their own compositional voice. And I'm wondering about University of Toronto in particular, because I know a lot of universities and colleges around Canada have distinct styles or trends, compositional trends, that we can sometimes link to specific times and eras where there was a faculty working, for example. Was there a particular mark or signature element of style, or perhaps even philosophical angle that rubbed off during this period of training at University of Toronto?
That's a great question, and I'm really fortunate that the right place and right time of where that school was in its history when I was there. I was there, I did my 4 years there from 93 to 97. And so the faculty there was definitely a product, for the most part, of a postmodern tradition. In the decades or the generation before us, Adrian, music academia was, when it comes to composition, music academia in the, pretty well the 50s into the 80s was very, very steeped in the serialist tradition. And, but I was fortunate, and I did learn the serialist tradition, and I was taught that, and I did experiment with, atonal compositions and so forth in my time there. But I wasn't limited to that. And I'm very grateful for that. I had some professors who were, were very steeped in the postmodern tradition of thinking of tonality in a new respect and thinking how we can expand from that. And so I look back at my portfolio of compositions that I left that school with, and I hear so many different things. I hear so many inspirations and influences. Yes, the early 20th century masters from Bartók or Schoenberg or, Stravinsky. Those are obvious. You can definitely hear some of those there. But I also hear the beginnings of where I am today, where there's a lot of, that's where I really discovered Philip Glass, and Steve Reich and their influences on my musical style today. Those things started there. So I feel so grateful for that, because I know a lot of people look back at their musical instruction and with a sort of the look at the rigidity that they were faced with, especially in composition, because what is composition? Composition is the ability for one person to share their voice, their personality, themselves. And if some institution or person, of stature says, no, you can't be that way, I mean, what a travesty that is. I feel sorry for it. And unfortunately, we live within a music culture where that was, very dictatorially dictated to people, that's how it had to be, but I'm happy that I didn't have that.
Yeah, it definitely seems, Frank, looking at your output of work and the mixed amount of projects and types of projects in your catalog, that perhaps early on or maybe down the road after your studies, that you really embrace this holistic approach into your creation process. At least it seems that way. in that you are working in what we would call the traditional classical realm, working with, as I mentioned, in chamber music, having written a great number of works for a variety of instruments and commissioned by performers. As well, I know you're playing in a band. You've been playing in a band for some time. You're an improviser. We talked about some of your works, dabbling in electronics and so forth. And just to kind of touch back on what you were mentioning a moment ago about finding your voice, feeling like you have to digest everything that you learned as a composer, as a young student, but obviously there must have been a turning point in your career, or perhaps in your personal life, where you understood that maybe the next step was taking the influences, taking your experiences, and carving your unique path, whether or not it clashes with convention as far as what's expected in the career path of the professional composer, so to speak, in the old guard. Was there a time where you were wrestling with this, that you perhaps were thinking about how your unique musical personality fits into the landscape of contemporary classical music, or was it something that you were always at peace with? I always wonder about that, as I have a lot of composer friends who are kind of separate their compositional life from the other sorts of creative projects they do. What are your thoughts on that, Frank?
Yeah, that's a great question. But for me personally, I don't try to distinguish those two things. They're really interconnected in who I am. That's just how I feel comfortable that way. You sort of asked about, was there a moment when I sort of felt maybe I started to get my voice, or where I started to feel comfortable in my composing skin of, hey, this is who I am. And that probably happened in 2001, actually. My wife and I had gone to Spain, and we had stayed in the south of Spain in a beautiful apartment. We rented an apartment in the south of Spain, and it was sort of in a remote place, but we were overlooking the Mediterranean. It was a very small town, and we did so many great trips, and there was no television in this place. We didn't have a telephone. So we felt like we were really alone in the world. It was very hot, but dry hot, and it was just almost like a very spiritual time, and it was cathartic, actually, because it was at times that week and a week to 10 days we stayed there, it was very uncomfortable, and I started doing a lot of soul searching. The reason why we were able to go on that trip, my wife had a very good job after we had both graduated from school and got married in 97. But 4 years into my professional career, like most of us have to do in order to establish ourselves and pay the bills, I was teaching. I was teaching a lot. I was teaching like almost 40, 50, private piano students a week. And I just found it overwhelming. And so going on this trip, my body had a chance just to calm down, but also, reevaluate who am I? What do I see myself doing? And I had a little notebook, and I made so many notes about potential future projects that I'd like to do, but also most importantly, who am I? What is my musical voice? Like up to that point, I sort of had a little bit still a lingering thing with the school mentality, which is, what does the world expect from me compositionally? Or if I do this, will the world start taking me, will they take me seriously? Or, look at that. And I needed that very cathartic moment in a beautiful place, inspiring place, to realize, I have to just be me, and I have to formulate my own ideas. So I came back from that trip. Oh, and I should also mention the thing that made that even more impactful when I got back from that trip is 2 days before we came back from that trip, the horrific September 11th terrorist attacks happened. And just watching that on TV in real time, just like after the cathartic journey of self-awareness and self-exploration that I went through, to watch this, how instantly in a thing, thousands of people were instantly impacted, reminds us that old adage in life: don't waste time. You know, I mean, anything could be taken away anytime. So it was like further just confirmed everything that I had learned about myself on that trip. And really from that moment on, I sort of began this journey that's really led to the present. All these many years later, we're talking, it's 20 years later now, right? That it's taken me a 20-year process to just keep churning it out, but keep churning it out with the basis of being, what is my voice? What voice do I feel comfortable with? Never mind what people might think of this. You know, and I always like telling people, the moment I stopped worrying about what people think of me is ironically once people became more interested in what I do. So
that's really interesting, and how that period in your life caused for self-reflection, and also kind of the awareness of what was starting to happen in the world that only became amplified, I think, many years later. And if we think about that as a really crucial turning point historically, also into the modern culture, I think there are these themes in your work that emerge and I think are very explicit, having to do with the environment, with love, mental health, and social justice, even some political topics. I noticed on your website you have some blog entries kind of discussing some of the prescient issues of the day. And I think these are all issues that are very much at the forefront of the social consciousness right now. However, I think looking back that these are themes that you've been dealing with in your work, it seems, for many years. Do you find that you will start very often a large project with a specific musical idea, or is it necessarily that there's extra musical concept or trigger for your creativity?
Yeah, I really, I love thinking about concepts first. If I have to I don't know, I would have to do a good, audit of my portfolio to see this. But I think without a doubt, a lot of the compositions on my portfolio, basically concept came first, notes came later. And that being said, a lot of the issues that you just talked about, I'm very passionate about, and it's taken me, for some more than others, it's taken me more years to be comfortable in exploring those issues in a creative standpoint, some easier than others. But I've really enjoyed that. Sometimes, that being said, I guess I often think of myself as composing wise, as all of my compositions are a reflection of me. So if somebody said to me, "Oh, you're the person where you always compose, about pieces around mental health or the environment or that kind of thing," that would be, I couldn't do that if somebody came up to me and said that. Either they don't know the other stuff I've done, or if I did do that, that doesn't feel like me. Because for me, my composition output reflects all aspects of me. I also have a lot of silly concepts and comedic things, and I have a lot of absolute music, where there's absolutely no program whatsoever, and it's just an exploration. So I think that's what I'm really grateful about being a composer, is that because I'm not compelled to have to fit a mold of what somebody thinks I should be, that means I've given myself the permission to really, really explore a lot of different things. And I'm really grateful for that, because what it does is it keeps things fresh. I think I always say sometimes I get bored easily, you know what I mean? So, maybe I might go through a stretch where I compose a bunch of pieces, maybe on some social justice theme, but at a certain point, I need a break, even just for my mental health, and even for mental health, I've composed some works and various types of works, but I love my life, how things can switch up. Like right now, as we're recording this, I'm composing a bunch of trumpet etudes, And that's something I've never done before. And none of them are programmatic. It's actually the most geekiest thing that I've organized, or that's organized in the collection of the thing, which is intervals. I'm basically trying to compose one trumpet etude based on each of the intervals from as small as a perfect unison all the way up to a major ninth. So that's where I get the 15. Can you think of anything more composer geeky like than that? You know what I mean? And I'm absolutely loving it. I'm having a great time, and I'm loving the ideas I'm fulfilling. So does that mean there's no sort of higher purpose for those pieces? Absolutely not. You know, it's going to have a higher purpose for, you know, trumpet players, and, you know, to improve their technique and maybe expose them to various techniques or ideas that will help improve their playing in other ways. And that's a good thing, and that's a helpful thing. And I feel like my voice was able to give something in that way. Like I've been able to contribute something to the world, you know?
Yeah, a piece like that especially sounds like a really valuable educational work for students, advancing in intervallic playing and trumpet, and certainly for yourself, gives you a lot of insight into how to score specifically for that instrument, with a lot of different nuances. Obviously, I think certainly one of the challenges of being a composer is embracing the language of all the different instruments, the limitations, the restrictions, some of the strengths of instruments that might not be immediately apparent if you open an orchestration book, that you would have to gauge by sitting directly with a musician or just kind of hearing them playing in a performance, perhaps them improvising. Is it the case with a lot of your commission works, Frank, for classical musicians, that those collaborations started as you having some familiarity with the performer, or vice versa? Perhaps they are aware with your output and style. Is it often the case you work with friends, or how do you go about your musical partnerships when it comes to commissioning classical music?
Yeah, it's a mix. It's a mix of any commission I received. It's a development of a relationship, a development of a working relationship, and even deeper than a working relationship, a creative relationship. Because, you know, for me, composing a piece is a very personal journey of me sharing something, and then to hand that over to a performer, they're sharing something quite deep. And so that's a very sensitive process that has to be gone through carefully and thoughtfully. It's sort of like, for me, there's honestly no other relationship like that except for maybe a romantic relationship. That's how deep it can be. So, I live an interesting life, and just like dating, or somebody has to make the first move, right? So sometimes I have people reaching out to me. First, they've heard of my previous work, and they have some ideas of a concept or a potential project, and then we hash it out together. I've had actually situations where people have reached out to me and I didn't feel comfortable with the concept. I didn't feel like it was my place to work on a project like that for any number of reasons, be it, the cultural references and who I am and what my place is within society. So sometimes it just doesn't work out, and then going the opposite way, often I reach out to others. I love listening to music. For me, one of my single greatest things that I have at my disposal is the ability to listen to what everybody else is doing and get inspired by that. And sometimes I get so inspired by what people are doing and appreciate what they're doing, I will actually reach out and say, hey, why don't we collaborate? So, and that's the great aspect of social media, right? Like you and I, we've started developing a relationship through social media. We would have never known each other if it wasn't through social media, and that has led to some mutual admiration for us to do this podcast together, and maybe even perhaps to collaborate together and make music together in the future. And all of this is possible with this sort of give and take. But at any given point, I'm always working on some composition. I'm very fortunate these days. Life is starting to get intense now to a point where, there's funding in place, there's a deadline for some performance or some recording and stuff like that. So I'm sort of lucky with that, but I never rest on my laurels. I'm always thinking about, okay, well, what's coming down the horizon? How do I start developing new relationships or solidifying the relationships that I have with people? But most importantly, do I enjoy the company of the people that I work with? For me, that's huge. Not only do I admire and respect what they do musically, but are they nice human beings? Life is too short, to spend, worrying about that. So I always like to think of myself, I always call myself a professional composer, out of respect to myself, and because sometimes I'm lucky enough to get money to compose music, but I'm not a professional to the point where I'm willing to do anything or everything or jeopardize my own mental health or put myself in a situation where I can't have good relationships with people, because if you don't, that's toxic. And if you're putting up with that kind of thing, that's scary.
Yeah, and I believe it has damaging effects on the product as well. I think there is that old adage that pressure creates, or whatever, heat creates combustion, creates results. But I think at the same time, looking back at those toxic relationships or situations, in most situations, things could be improved with the right personnel, or if there's a little mediation involved. So many cases, I think it may be too late. And even if you end up working with somebody of a very high, very distinguished career, it's not necessarily the case that it's going to be a lasting musical or personal partnership, is of course. So it seems like, we've mentioned mental health a couple times already, and also having discussed how things had sort of come to a grinding halt a couple of years ago for most of us. I think it was, especially for performers, when the whole pandemic settled in, everything shutting down and performances, opportunities kind of dissolving overnight. A lot of us were kind of left to our own devices to try to get our creative voices out there nevertheless. And I think this podcast is actually a product of that. Actually, Frank, actually had some time in 2020 to kind of experiment, and had this idea of doing a podcast for some time, because I do spend a lot of time listening to interviews. And moreover, I'm just quite curious about the creative process, composers and performers and other people who are normally, I think, working in a lot of isolation, but I think even more so given the shutdown. And obviously, one of the big projects you've been working on that you've completed in the last couple of years was your Music for Self-Isolation, is a large, multifaceted video project, recording project with a number of musicians composing original work. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your inspiration for the work, how you reached out to the performers involved, what were the conversations involved, and sort of what was the creative direction with the project, given your own background and your reflections on how the landscape of classical music and the delivery is sort of changing before our very eyes. Just some thoughts about your large project, Music for Self-Isolation.
Yeah, thank you. That really has been a saving grace in my own personal life and my musical life. This last, well, what's now feels like it's coming up to a couple of years, or at least last year and a half, when it just feels like the pandemic came out of nowhere that hit our music community. And last March, well, suddenly when everything started shutting down here in Toronto as far as performances go, and even for myself personally, a big commission that I received for a composition by a performance group in Ecuador. Was scheduled. I even had the plane tickets all ready to go to that last summer to Ecuador. That was canceled. Other residencies were also postponed or canceled. So I felt like I was like the legs were taken right out underneath me suddenly, but nothing compared to how I felt for my friends who were performers. And when all of it went down, and it feels like everything just stopped in the world, and especially for our music community, I feel so, my heart really goes out to people who feel like, well, I have nothing now. I have no structure. I have nothing to look forward to. You know what it's like. When you know the gig is coming up, you're practicing, you're focused, and all of a sudden that was gone. Just talking to some of my musical friends, and I thought to myself, I feel like I have to do something about being in this moment. We were all told to stay at home. You have to stay at home. Nobody's allowed to go out. Nothing. And a lot of people are by themselves. So my heart especially went out to people who had no partners or that kind of thing, that might have been single and living by themselves. I mean, what a emotional, mental toll, especially for a musician who's used to being so social. So one Sunday morning, I thought to myself, what if I composed a short little piece for a solo instrument for as many different instruments as I can, and I just do one piece a day, and just literally just share it out there. And I remember I did a Facebook post. I said, if I was to compose a solo piece, for any instrument, what instruments should I compose for? And I was inundated with these requests of, the more popular, common instruments, but some interesting instruments. And at that point, I realized, oh, wow, people are really looking for something, to do while they're at home, especially something that's relevant to the time in which we live in. How can we feel purpose, be respectful to the tragedies that's ensuing, and the sadness that's ensuing, yet also still feel some hope? And that was that sort of mentality of, yes, sometimes being elegiac or melancholy because, oh, this is a tough time, but also giving that feeling of hope. I really used that framework, that mindset, as the basis for each of the compositions. And what ended up happening over the course of almost 6 weeks, I ended up composing over 30 solo pieces for a variety of different instruments and voice, some a cappella voice works. And what a great experience. And I just started posting the compositions. I was sending them to friends and sharing them with musicians, colleagues in my network, and saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. Here it is. Do whatever you want with this, And it was just overwhelming what happened next. It was just people, I guess, the compositions themselves, the pieces themselves resonated with people. And what people started doing was recording themselves at home, playing it. And sometimes in a very poignant atmosphere, being all by themselves and that kind of thing. And they started posting them online. And over the course of the next year, over 150 musicians from all around the world posted performances or performed them, in live stream concerts, but mostly just they practiced, they recorded, and they posted on their social media channels or YouTube or that kind of thing. And it was just overwhelming how all of a sudden we didn't feel like we were alone anymore. But then what ended up happening after that was we felt like we had to have a little more deeper conversations about how this was impacting. And so we got some funding from the Canada Council, I believe, and we did some I did some audio documentaries of some of the people that participated, posting videos of themselves performing the pieces, talking more in depth about what the pandemic was like at that point. That was done last fall. And then we got funding to record an album. So we recorded the album of musicians in an empty Roy Thompson Hall here in Toronto. We had a documentary filmed about the experience and interviewing the musicians that were involved, again, talking more about it. So what ended up happening of just keeping myself busy, trying to feel like I'm relevant to the time, ended up, the project sort of took off in a way where it became a platform for people just to talk and share, just like what you're doing. Like, wonderful thing, Adrian, how you started this podcast, and some of our other friends in our community, how we're just using the technological tools to create conversations, to support each other, maybe to learn some new things, some new perspectives that maybe helps better ourselves or keep our personalities. And that's what this ended up being. It became just more than, I just feel like I got to compose something relevant to this time and I'll share it with, my network of musician friends. It just became this awesome thing that I'm so grateful that it's become part of my life. And, we're talking about mental health. I do have a history of dealing with mental health issues, specifically depression. And, normally somebody like me, should have been really struggling. But it wasn't, ironically, the pandemic, in a way, as bad as the outside world was from an inside, insular way. And as much as I miss seeing family and friends, able to see them personally, that aspect wasn't great, obviously. But I, despite all that, I was able to keep from going crazy, so to speak, and keep my bearings. And ironically, the pandemic was far from my worst time in dealing with my mental health issues. So I think partly for that, other than love and support from friends and family, was working on that project and the connecting with people in a community. It's all about connection, right? If that's anything comes out of the pandemic, it's got to be like, oh my gosh, we gotta stay connected with people. So
Absolutely. Yeah. And it sounds like with the project itself, keeping you really busy during that time was probably really a positive, force to keep you motivated and give other people a purpose, which I think is really the key element, is that, like you said, the music is really resonating in a way that wasn't before, and I think we miss, like you mentioned, the social aspect of the immediate applause or the feedback after the concert. People come up to you and talk and remark on your composition, or your performance, good or bad. But nevertheless, the connection is really something that we can take for granted, I think. So if there's a silver lining, I think it is that, there's been people like yourself and others that are taking advantage of the opportunity and the technology and our networks to bring us together, try to give also a platform for many of us who have a lot of internal issues that we all might be dealing with, even at the best of times. I think, as musicians and artists and creators, I think we live in a very internal kind of world with our own thoughts kind of resonating, and often very self-critical and under a lot of anxiety and pressure for different reasons. So for that reason, I think, just thinking about your catalog and this particular work, and now I think the lid has been lifted a little bit on our society, where this issue of mental health, and maybe only very recently, had been attached with a sort of stigma where everybody was often very guarded about speaking about anything regarding mental health. Even physical health issues would be something that people would discuss openly, but for whatever reason, and perhaps even more so in our community, there was an attitude of sort of keep it to yourself, perhaps, deal with it in a certain way. Or, you have your music, so that should be your kind of therapeutic outlet. And when that's not enough, I think, people realize that, no, we do have to connect, we do have to talk, do have to actually open up to people. Have there been people, colleagues, or people in your life who have particularly commented on that, and I wonder, has your approach to championing mental health issues changed or intensified during this period of time, where it does seem like everybody's, or at least there's more of a conversation being had about these issues, and more of an empathy that we have for everybody else now, knowing that most of us, or many of us, deal with similar issues, maybe on lower levels. What sort of feedback have you received, Frank, regarding that particular theme in your work?
Oh, it's been wonderful. Years ago, when I sort of made the artistic decision that I was going to start composing pieces based on my own personal challenges dealing with mental health issues, that was sort of one sort of important step that I needed to do in my own sort of healing process, to do what I talked about earlier, which is, to be the true composer that I want to be. I want to use my composition. I need to use my compositions to share who I am. So I couldn't keep that bottled up anymore, and so that's what I did. But then, of course, after I did that, then I went, am I going to, you know what it's like, right? You put something out there, well, you have to stand behind it. People might want to talk to you about it, either audience or journalists or, people about, well, you composed this piece on this theme, and of course you could be the elusive artist type and not talk about it, but that's never been my style. I don't mind talking about, my artistic process. So, I felt like I had to stand behind my work, and talk about why I did this and did that. And thankfully, that has been a wonderful journey. That's probably for the last 5 years. I put out a solo piano album. That was sort of my unofficial announcement to the world that, I'm willing to explore mental health issues or talk about my own mental health issues publicly through my work, when I put out an album of solo piano compositions back in 2017. So it's been, I should correct myself, it's 4 years. So that was 4 years ago. And since then, it's been wonderful. It's been an absolute thing, because I've just been, honestly, I haven't really pushed it or anything, because it still feels a bit weird to talk about it. It's still, it's not something that I'm cured from. I still have days where I can get pretty down. Thankfully, not as often as it used to be, but through a lot of hard work, I have a lot of coping mechanisms to help me deal with it. But I'm not a recovered, I'm not recovered. I just manage it. That's how I like to think of it. And so I don't really have to make much of an effort. And people seek me out to talk about this, because I have talked about it. And I don't know how Google algorithms work, but I get the most random emails sometimes from people, who would like to interview me, or, invite me to do a concert based around these compositions that I did, and, talk about the compositions in the middle of the, in between performing them. And so I'm proud of myself for doing this, but I also realize that if people are searching me out and finding me for this, that means there's a lot of people out there. Not too many people are doing this yet. And that's concerning for me. I think we need to continue having more open conversations. We need to have a music community where people are getting the help they need. And then if they do feel inclined, then allowing them a platform to speak out about it more. I think that's important. If they are inclined, no, there should be no pressure to do that. But first and foremost, you have to be mentally healthy yourself. But the fact that there's not a lot of people out there shows exactly what you were just talking about, Adrian. There's still a lot of work to do. As much as we've done a great job in maybe the last 5-10 years of breaking down a lot of stigmas around mental health, it's hard. But I think for our music community, it's especially hard. Anybody who's sort of in a gig economy, nobody wants to show weakness. because everybody's afraid that they're going to lose the gig if they show any weakness. I think it's easier, I shouldn't say stuff like this, but maybe it's easier for people who work in corporations and they have set, things to help people. Anybody who works independently in a gig economy like us and musicians or any other number of fields, it's a lot harder. You just want to curl up and do that. That's scary. And we need to, as a society, not look down upon people or think that their work will not be of quality just because they discuss these types of things. I think maybe for me, it's a lot easier within this music world because I don't work for an orchestra. I don't have a steady paycheck coming from an institution I don't teach at a faculty. So I have no real worries about what my peers might think of me. Only potentially the people who might want to collaborate and commission me. But you know what? I teach privately, and for a lot of my students, they know about it, and they're very respectful. I've had conversations with a 10-year-old kid who attended my concert where I performed these pieces on my mental health challenges and talked about my own personal journey in between. I had the most poignant conversation with a 10-year-old, one of my 10-year-old student right after the performance, who really talked about how they loved the performance and really talked to me like the pieces that I played or what I talked about, they were talking to me with the objectivity as if somebody would talk about like you broke your leg or you had cancer or you had a health condition or something that needed to be dealt with. Well, I thought that was the most beautiful thing. So you could see society builds up these preconceived notions. A child knew that it wasn't a big deal. It's a health issue. It's not a attitude issue or something like that. And that taught me so much. The children teach us so much, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I was thinking about that particular point you made about reaching out to students and young students that are entering the music world or just entering the world, I think, in general. But those that I do teach, that are younger and ambitious, aspiring professionals, I think that there's a whole set of challenges and pressures that did not exist when, certainly when I was a student. And a lot of those are tied into social media and just access to a lot of what's going on. And despite the fact, social media is beneficial and helpful and perhaps even necessary, to a large degree to kind of forge a career, it is one of those things where you have to develop a healthy moderation and also know how to separate yourself and not attach your identity, right, to what's going on online and how people are reacting to your posts or, negative interactions online, online bullying. These are things that, like I said, are just not really as evident when I was growing up and certainly not as pronounced. So I think about that very often, and I think actually we've noticed in the last couple of years, but even longer than that, this sort of endemic effect of anxiety and advanced levels of anxiety with people who are, we would think at a certain age that they shouldn't be grappling with such heavy issues, but there again tells you that we never know what people are dealing with behind closed doors, and I think for a lot of students also, music is a form of therapy, is a form of escape. And I try to give those young students, without making them cynical or giving them a negative portrait of what's to come, sort of a realistic, but also hopefully a sort of a guiding voice, and that, your colleagues are there to help you, and that, the people that you work with should be people that you gain benefit from, spiritually or emotionally, creatively, that, they're not people who are entering into a 9-to-5 job, like you said, with human resources and, benefits and vacation pay and all these things that you eventually have to learn that you need to work on your own, fortify your own castle in a certain way. As a performer, you also have to be an entrepreneur or as a composer. And you have to be also your own guardian in a lot of ways. And that takes, for a lot of people, I think it takes some years to figure out, if ever. So I think it's really important that through your music and through your, through your writings, even online, and your discussions, that it gives people a platform, and it gives a sort of a safe space for people to open up about these issues. Talking also about a recent project, Frank, Project Dovetail, I think it's an album that you were working on in the last couple of years, if I'm not mistaken, that involved a number of performers in chamber music, mostly, referencing extra musical works, some works of Paulo Coelho. Also, I noticed some political influences. What was the driving force that brought about Project Dovetail, and how did you get it off the ground and determine who and what performers you were going to work with?
Project Dovetail is my 14th album of my compositions that I've had the pleasure of releasing to the world. It came out last month. And that was an interesting project, as you said, because it was all compositions inspired by something else, specifically some other type of specific piece of art or art form. So there's pieces on there that are inspired by visual art, some by works of literature, some films, etc. And they vary with instrumentation. It's I've always been a fan of film, TV. Reading, I'm a huge visual art fan, very inspired by, if I have to pick one other art form, it'd probably be visual art. I just love visual art because I think about how a painter creates a painting. I see so many similarity in how I think in my mind how a piece of music comes together. So I think but the synesthesia kicks in, but they get to have some real color to see it, and there's so many linkages there. So I always thought to myself, I had basically Project Dovetail is a compilation album. It features a lot of my various compositions that I've done over the years, all coming together in this platform to sort of share my output on that specific type of thing. And we had conceived this album as a way to bring some of these various chamber compositions together quite a few years ago, actually, about maybe 3 years ago, and we got some funding and everything was ready to go. But of course, then the pandemic happened and we weren't able to get into the studio. So the album should have actually come out last year. But we were able to, over the course of 2020, despite the pandemic, we were able to get into the studio and safely record and take precautions to record it little by little. And then Music for Self-Isolation came out. So it sort of felt that Project Dovetail kept getting pushed more and more. But I'm so happy with that album because, like I said earlier, I think every one of my compositions and every one of my albums, it shows like a different part of my personality. And, I'm very grateful that over the course of this past year, I've had a chance to release 3 different albums. Project Dovetail is the 3rd. And each one of those 3, not to mention the 14 total that I've released for the past 10, 15 years, they all reflect some part of my personality. I love the experimentation of Project Dovetail. I love the willing to take musical chances and be sometimes very frenetic. And I had so much fun putting that together because it just gave me a little bit of a break from, dealing with things like the pandemic and the sadness of that, and just sort of getting back to the nuts and bolts of being a composer. And meanwhile, I'm so lucky. I had so many amazing musicians play the various pieces on the album that came into the studio here in Toronto for us to record that at various points. But man, it was crazy, because I think the first recording session we had was in January 2020 and the last was November 2020. And it was just, at one point last spring, all the recording studios were shut down here. So it was so awesome to finally be able to put that out. It was just such a great experience.
I also wanted to touch a little bit on your work in ambient music, electronic music, and also I know you've done some work in film scoring, TV, and perhaps this ties into your discussion of visual arts, and that I think ambient music, especially, I think lends itself very closely to video, and perhaps in many cases. Seeing a beautiful image of, motion picture or even abstract colors maybe kind of inspires the movement of sounds, or sort of the gelling of sounds, or a landscape. I discovered some beautiful music on your website from Happiness in a Troubled World. And I'm wondering, was this one of the albums you recorded last year as well, Frank? How do you separate, I guess, or how do you go about composing in this style? Are some of these works predetermined for film or video projects, or are they unrelated? Tell us a little bit about your work with ambient music.
Yeah, I love ambient music. I love that genre, and it's and actually the album you're referencing, Happiness in a Troubled World, that was the first of the 3 albums that came out this year, earlier this January. So the first of the 3, and that was my first time ever producing an album of my compositions, which was just purely electronic. I never done that before, so that was really exciting for me. I was every time I make an album, I always think, like I said, like, how can I put, how could it be something interesting and unique, either in concept or the performing forces or the process of making it. But obviously electronic music has been such a huge part of my life, even before I put that album out, because, like you said, of the work I've done in the film and television production music. That's something that, especially the last 5-6 years, has been a really big part of my life creatively. And it's sort of an interesting field, because composing film and TV production music isn't the way film and TV music used to be done, where the director or the producer would work directly with the composer would compose directly to screen. Now it's all sort of, you compose the music first, and then the film and TV producers find what works well. But of course, you do that with the idea that will be its final destination. And I'm very fortunate that I've developed a network and worked at developing a network of music libraries across the world that has my music in it. And it's a very different thing, but I've always been such a fan of film and TV. I literally pretty well watch a film a day. Like one night, I'll watch a film every night, something on Netflix or Oscar-nominated films. And not to show too much of my OCD here, but I keep copious notes of every film I've ever seen before too. I have like lists on my computer, like for years and years, of all these films. I just absolutely love the genre so much, of the idea of storytelling. And maybe that's why a lot of times my music tends to tell stories. And I often think of how I might construct one of my albums like a film. A filmmaker has to tell this story from beginning to end. It's a little bit more elongated. I love concept albums, because I think music can tell a story of how we either compose all the pieces together, or we compile them from your various works to tell a story. And so I think that's why it's been such a big part of my life. Actually, when I was in university, the plan, because we always have plans, they never happen the way we plan it, but I thought that when I was going to graduate, I didn't see myself going into academia music-wise. So I only did my bachelor's at U of T. I didn't go on to a master's or any graduate work. And I thought that because I thought I was going to move to Los Angeles or get established in Toronto and be a film composer. That was going to be my big thing. And then when I got into it, I started doing that type of thing. And when I graduated in the 90s, I did quite a bit of work in it for a lot of independent productions, but it wasn't really for me. I didn't find there was something aspect of it that even to this day, I'm still not quite sure, why I didn't get fully into it. And I admire people who do it, who are intense about it, and who just constantly churn out amazing work and are very creative about it. But the genre, that specific subgenre of composing, I really admire people who do it. And I think that's why I've sort of moonlighted with the film, TV production music as a way to keep in it. And the other thing I've learned from that process, which is very fascinating, is that my concert music, more of my artistic art music, modern classical music, whatever you want to call it, that I put out there, that the film TV work I've done over the years has really leaked into that. And maybe, like you talk about Happiness in a Troubled World, that album, a lot of those pieces could be literally, pieces used in film and television. And I'm sure subconsciously they were conceived like that and that type of thing. And oppositely, it's happened too. I've gotten my music in a lot of libraries, and they're dealing with a lot of people who might come from a pop background musically, and then I'm sharing music to have included in their thing, and they're like, wow, I've never heard anything like this before, so unique soundscapes. It can't be too busy, it's got to be calm and moody, to fit in the back of the scene. So I love the fact, as much as sometimes I've thought to myself, just pick one and really focus on it and be the best you can on it. I'm sort of happy just from a purely creative standpoint that I continue to keep my foot in some of these. And like you mentioned earlier, I've done some improvising over the years and playing in a band and that type of thing. So everything just stays fresh, when I don't sort of try to pigeonhole myself too much.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how, during the time that you were studying and sort of aspiring to be a film composer as a young composer and musician, how that whole industry is sort of changed, but also become very accessible to people, who are not only perhaps lack the formal musical education to get started, but also now the amount of sound resources and technological resources available to anybody with a laptop now can and often do kind of compose their own video projects, and it sort of brought that world which is previously inaccessible if you didn't have access to a studio or videographers. That it's cool to see how now people are able to create their own really compelling video projects with their own music, and interesting to see how, not just in the music, but I think the whole film industry in general has changed from, now people are not going out really en masse to movie theaters, and perhaps that may never come back again, so I think the medium has changed, and logically also the art is sort of adapting with it. Touching on your work as a pianist and improviser and the many projects you've done, I wanted to lastly talk about something I noticed you did some years ago in 2013 was a 24-hour piano marathon. And this is available on Frank's YouTube channel, I believe, still. It's exactly as it sounds. Frank was performing, I believe, improvising, Frank, but I'd like you to provide a little bit of clarity on what you played, how you sequenced the music, and how on earth you were physically able to endure 24 hours. Did you eat? Did you drink? I can't even imagine. I take 2 hours of teaching and I need to go eat a sandwich or take a nap or something. But what was the impetus for this very ambitious and very exhausting project, I imagine?
Yeah, it's great that you brought that up, because that was quite a few years ago I did that. And as it's funny, like in our lives as musicians, right, we tend to go project to project and do these things, and then you just focus on the new thing, and it's easy to forget about stuff. So I'm so happy you brought this up, because that definitely does bring up a lot of memories. I think it was 2013, 2014. I can't remember for sure. It was definitely in there. So it's been definitely the years have happened. But basically the short story of it is, in the neighborhood that my wife and I live here in Toronto, in the South Etobicoke neighborhood of Etobicoke, we have a wonderful community arts organization called Lakeshore Arts. And when we first moved into this neighborhood, I reached out to them to become a member of this organization, to network with the local artists in the community. It was awesome. And I loved what they did and the mandate they stood for, that I eventually joined their board of directors. And I sat on their board of directors for many years. And I was actually president of the board for that many years. And I'm still affiliated with them to this day. My piano teaching studio is located in their office space. Now I'm a tenant. I rent space from them to teach my students and practice piano. I have my piano housed in their space. So they're just an absolutely wonderful organization that helps artists and gives outreach to community in general. And they've had this great mandate for 25 years now and been doing so much great work. And back in those years, when I was the board president, there was a lot of government cutbacks of funding for their programs. And I thought to myself, okay, well, my term as board president is coming up. I'm just a lowly musician. I don't have money I can donate from my own pocket, excess money. So I'm thinking, what can I do to create some buzz or help this organization that I love so much out? And this is where the idea came about. I've always been a little bit... I've always been intrigued by marathon compositions too, just from a musical standpoint, these super long, and I have composed some continuous hour-long compositions, set compositions and things like that. But just the idea of playing for 24 hours just seemed crazy. So we did it as a fundraiser for this organization that we love so much. And so basically what I did was I started on a Friday at 6 p.m., and I ended, was it 6 p.m.? No. Yeah, it was 6 p.m. It must have been 6 p.m. Friday, 6 p.m. And I ended on Saturday maybe it was 3 p.m. Sorry. So Friday at 3 p.m. to Saturday at 3 p.m. That's how we did it. We set it up where the community can come by and watch. It was just a drop in, and I was just in their main gallery space playing. And now people often say, well, what did you do? Go to the washroom? Well, I wouldn't play I wasn't sitting at the piano for every minute. The rule was play for 55 minutes, get a rest for 5 minutes, to use the washroom and to eat. And so you asked, what did I eat? Well, I was eating little snacks, and I had a lot of protein, high protein. We set up a cot on their second floor. If I needed to take a 1 or 2 minute power nap, I would. I never did that, but I did definitely lie down on the floor sometimes. And I guess the toughest thing about that, I did improvise it. You asked that. I did improvise it. The whole thing, and that was wonderful. I had some guest musicians join me that I played along with. That was a lot of fun. But definitely the two aspects that were most difficult was the cramping. My hand would start to cramp, so sometimes I would just play left hand only. I had to keep playing it. That was the rule. Sound had to come from that electric piano. So sometimes I would be putting my hand down like this to get the cramp out because the palm of my hand was cramping up. Also, the middle of the night was terribly excruciating. We always take for granted as musicians that we feed off the energy of an audience, right? The fact that there was always somebody there watching for the first 12 hours, or first 9 hours, I should say, was absolutely amazing. But after midnight, when everybody left, and it was just my wife in the room with me, and the lights were out, there was nobody allowed. We locked the doors just for safety and stuff, because we were actually literally out. Their community space is a storefront on the main street here in Toronto. It was so agonizingly difficult, and your mind starts playing on tricks on you. But thankfully, that Saturday morning, people started showing up again, and you got a little boost, and it was all live streamed. So what you discuss about you can watch the entire 24 hours. It's on my YouTube channel, and that was a live stream, a YouTube live stream that just went on to YouTube right away. And it was live streamed, so we were accepting donations online. People were watching all around the planet and thinking that this was crazy and awesome. And we ended up making some good money, raising some amazing money that they really needed. So would I ever do it again? I don't think so. I never say never, but because it was so physically and emotionally exhausting. Playing, like you said, playing music or teaching music is very demanding on the thing. And that's what I did. I was always playing it. I was playing for real. I wasn't just going da, 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 not caring what I was playing. I was actually really purposely making music in a very and a very thing. And of course, the more tired I got, the more melancholy it got. And it was just like this vicious cycle, that I started making myself feel more melancholy because what I was hearing was melancholy. And anyway, so thank you for bringing me back on memory lane for that. But that was nuts.
I can imagine, and I'm curious as to if there's any of those middle of the night snippets of spontaneous creativity that ever kind of you were able to use later on compositions, or that kind of ideas emerged out of nowhere that maybe just in the cloud of exhaustion, perhaps, something came to you.
Not consciously, but you know what? I've actually contemplated over the years. I've watched snippets of it, but I actually can't watch it too much because it actually brings back too much memories of being that exhausted. And it's like, I don't even want to go there to relive it because of the feelings you had. But I've actually contemplated like borrowing themes, like go back and listen to some themes that I had there and maybe make actual compositions out of it, like some spin-off project. But I've never done that. But yeah, I'm sure there must be some interesting musical moments in there. Needless to say, if you play something for 24 hours, something interesting might have come out of it. So.
Of course, yeah. And at the same time, I definitely understand why you'd be a little hesitant to revisit that particular time, just kind of going right back into it. I find it kind of difficult to watch performances of myself, even under the best circumstances. So it sort of does take you right back into that moment. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today, Frank, for sharing with us your background, your philosophies as a composer, as a musician, your personal issues that you've been working through in your music, and so happy to hear that you've been so fruitful and productive during the pandemic, and very excited to see what comes next. So again, I want to thank you so much for your time, and anytime you have something else you're working on you want to talk about, always more than welcome to come back on, and I'd be happy to talk to you again.
Well, Adrian, it's been a true pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation, so thank you for having me.